I think I told you guys after COVID, it's not about money anymore. I want to be in business with people that I'm aligned with and that I have good relationships with. And
that was Dana White just a few.
So here's what went down just a few months ago. Dana White was sitting pretty, talking about his rock-solid relationship with Alex Pereira, painting this picture of perfect partnership and mutual respect. But man, how things can change in the blink of an eye. That relationship is completely shattered now, blown to smithereens. Alex has officially put pen to paper on this absolutely massive contract outside the UFC. And let me tell you, Dana White is not just upset, he's losing his absolute mind. And we're not talking about some regular frustration here because he lost a marketable star, though that's bad enough. No, this goes way deeper than that. What's really eating at him, what's driving him completely insane, is exactly who Alex decided to sign with. The implications of this move are staggering, and I'm gonna break down every single detail of why this has Dana seeing red and what it means for the entire landscape of mixed martial arts. Let me walk you through this explosive situation step by step.
I think I told you guys after COVID, it's not about money anymore. I want to be in business with people that I'm aligned with and that I have good relationships with. And you don't know who anybody is until the shit hits the fan. And when the shit hit the fan, I found out who was who and what was what. And
the massive contract that made Dana White explode into a volcanic rage that shook the entire UFC headquarters. Dana White didn't just get angry, he absolutely exploded. And honestly, there's no other way to accurately describe the nuclear level reaction that sources inside the UFC headquarters witnessed firsthand when the news reached the president's desk. We're talking about Alex Pereira, his most marketable champion, his golden goose, allegedly signing this massive contract completely outside the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Think about that for a second, his biggest star making moves behind his back, the volcanic temper that has become absolutely legendary throughout the entire combat sports world, reportedly erupted with an intensity that even longtime UFC executives, people who've seen Dana at his worst, described as completely exceptional and off the charts. These are people who've witnessed Dana's legendary blow-ups for years, and they're saying this was something else entirely. The massive contract in question wasn't just some simple endorsement deal that fighters sign all the time. Oh no, this was way bigger than that. This was allegedly a commercial arrangement so monumentally significant that it threatened the very foundation of the exclusive relationships that the UFC maintains with its corporate partners, the kind of partnerships that bring in millions and millions of dollars. Sources are describing it as a multi-million-dollar agreement that would position Pereira as the central figure, the face, the main attraction of a business venture that existed entirely outside Dana White's control and oversight. This is exactly the very kind of arrangement that the UFC president has spent literally decades trying to prevent, the nightmare scenario he's built his entire business model to avoid. What made this alleged contract so absolutely explosive in Dana's mind? The scope, the scale, the sheer audacity of it all. This was reportedly not just another sponsorship deal added to Pereira's already incredibly impressive portfolio of brand partnerships. This was allegedly a deal structured in such a way that it could rival what the UFC itself was paying Alex, and here's the kicker, it was structured in a way that completely circumvented the contractual restrictions that typically bind UFC fighters to organizational oversight and approval. The alleged contract represented absolutely everything Dana White feared about the changing landscape of fighter empowerment in the modern era of combat sports, where social media and global reach give fighters unprecedented leverage. The explosion from Dana was immediate and visceral, like a pressure cooker finally bursting. Sources describe White's face turning bright red, his voice rising to levels that could literally be heard through closed office doors throughout the building, and a stream of profanity that would make even the most hardened cage fighters wince in discomfort. This wasn't just business frustration, this was genuine fury, the kind of raw emotional response that emerges when someone feels fundamentally betrayed by someone they trusted completely. Staff members reportedly cleared the hallways as the UFC president's rage echoed through the corporate headquarters like thunder, creating an atmosphere of tension that lingered for hours after the initial outburst.
A tactical battle, we'll say, in the main event.
Yeah.
Crowned a new champion tonight, though. I guess, can you give us your initial thoughts on the main event tonight?
Yeah, it was, not what I expected. I expected a lot more shooting, expected a lot more exchanges. Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to see Alex back here or not tonight, but we haven't seen him yet.
He signed what exactly? White allegedly shouted at the top of his lungs when the devastating news was first delivered to him, according to multiple sources who were familiar with the entire situation and witnessed the aftermath. Picture this scene. the most powerful man in mixed martial arts, someone who's built a billion-dollar empire on control and loyalty, finding out that his biggest star had gone behind his back. The UFC president reportedly demanded to see every single detail of Pereira's existing contracts, going through them with a fine-tooth comb, searching desperately for any clause that might have been violated, any piece of leverage that could be used to block or completely unwind the alleged deal. This wasn't just curiosity, this was a man in full crisis mode, mobilizing every resource at his disposal. Legal teams were summoned from their offices immediately, emergency conference calls were scheduled with lawyers and executives, and the entire apparatus of the UFC's massive business operation shifted into full-blown crisis mode. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar organization pivoting on a dime, because one fighter made a move that threatened everything Dana had built. The implications of this alleged massive contract extended far beyond just a single fighter's commercial ambitions. This was about the future of the entire sport. If Pereira had indeed found a way to sign a significant deal outside UFC control, it would represent a fundamental challenge to the business model that Dana White had carefully constructed and refined over more than 2 decades of ruthless competition. Other fighters would inevitably see this and seek similar arrangements, creating a domino effect that could reshape the entire industry. The carefully maintained wall between UFC oversight and fighter independence would begin to crumble, brick by brick, until the whole system collapsed. The Brazilian knockout artist had already built a commercial empire that extended far beyond the octagon, with partnerships spanning multiple industries and continents, but this alleged new contract was reportedly in a completely different league entirely. His existing partnership with Octagon as a global ambassador represented just one pillar of his massive commercial presence, while his deals with Scribe to promote their Aviator game showed his reach into the gaming world. His estimated net worth hovers between $4 and $5 million, with recent paydays including approximately $2,092 for UFC 307 and $2,042 for UFC 300. Solid money, but nothing compared to what this alleged massive outside contract was reportedly designed to deliver. This was the kind of deal that made Dana White see red, the kind of arrangement that threatened the very exclusivity upon which the UFC's lucrative corporate partnerships depended. White had built his entire empire on the principle of control, controlling the narrative, controlling the money, controlling the relationships, and this alleged contract represented the ultimate loss of that control, the thing he feared most in the world of combat sports business.
Dana, going back to Alex tonight, there's been a little bit of talk about, he's everywhere around the world, right? He's flying to Sydney, he's doing all this stuff when he could be, maybe training at home. Do you feel like that maybe affected his performance?
That's a good question. I think that's a question definitely for him to answer. I definitely don't know his schedule. I know he's been bouncing around.
White's words carried an
The timing of this alleged massive contract explosion could not have been more strategically devastating or personally insulting for the UFC president, hitting him right at a moment when he thought everything was under control. Alex Pereira had recently reclaimed his light heavyweight title at UFC 320 by absolutely demolishing Magomed Ankalaev in just 80 seconds via technical knockout, reminding the entire world exactly why he had become one of the most feared knockout artists in the entire sport. This wasn't just a victory, it was a statement, a reminder of his incredible value as a fighter and a draw. This stunning, explosive victory came after his unanimous decision loss to Ankalaev at UFC, a fight that Dana White himself had publicly described as disappointing in terms of the action it produced, criticizing both fighters for playing it too safe and not giving the fans the kind of excitement they paid to see.
I would say yes, that Sheikh Turkey and Saudi are the dominant players in boxing right now. And basically, I'm going to run and manage the business for them. This is not an easy business to be in.
The UFC president's concerns about Pereira's outside activities had been steadily building for months before this alleged contract bombshell dropped like a nuclear weapon on his desk. Questions had been raised internally about whether Pereira's extensive traveling schedule and growing promotional obligations were negatively affecting his performance inside the octagon, potentially distracting him from the absolutely grueling training regimen required to compete at the highest levels of mixed martial arts. There were whispers in the hallways about whether Alex was spreading himself too thin, whether his focus was shifting away from fighting toward building his commercial empire. These concerns had been simmering beneath the surface, creating tension that nobody wanted to address directly, but everyone could feel in the air whenever Pereira's name came up in business meetings.
I thought I was busy. I didn't realize what busy really was until the last couple of weeks. But yeah, we're gonna. I think I told you this to you guys before, but we're gonna invest like $10 to $12 million into jiu-jitsu over the next year. So we're gonna go big on that. We're obviously going big on boxing. We're gonna continue to do what we do with the UFC, and then switching Power Slap over to YouTube.
White had been dropping hints for months about Pereira's jet-setting lifestyle, comments that seemed casual on the surface but carried a definite undertone of warning that now seemed absolutely prophetic, given what had transpired. The Brazilian champion had been bouncing around the globe like a ping-pong ball, making high-profile appearances in Sydney and various other international locations, racking up frequent flyer miles instead of putting in the hard training hours that had made him champion in the first place. His expanding partnership with Spribe had extended to major appearances at Sigma Central Europe in Rome, where he was treated like royalty and commanded appearance fees that rivaled his fight purses, while his ongoing work with Stake positioned him alongside other major UFC athletes, including former champion Israel Adesanya, creating a network of fighter influencers that operated somewhat independently of UFC oversight. But absolutely nothing in Pereira's previous commercial activities had prepared Dana White for the earth-shattering news of an alleged massive contract that existed entirely outside UFC control, a deal so significant that it threatened to fundamentally alter the balance of power in their relationship. Here was a fighter who had signed an 8-fight contract extension at UFC 300. Publicly stating that starting with that fight, there were 8 more fights locked up on his contract, creating what should have been years of guaranteed partnership and mutual profit. And yet this same fighter, the same man who had made those public commitments, was allegedly signing a massive deal outside the organization that could fundamentally alter the balance of power between fighters and the UFC itself. The explosion from Dana White was just the opening salvo of what promised to be the most significant fighter versus organization conflict in recent UFC history, a battle that could reshape how business is done in mixed martial arts. The alleged massive contract had lit a fuse under a powder keg that could not be easily extinguished, and the reverberations would be felt throughout the industry for years to come. What made this entire situation particularly dangerous and threatening for the UFC was the absolutely terrible timing of when this bombshell dropped. The organization was in the midst of unprecedented expansion across multiple continents and business verticals, with Dana White's attention necessarily divided across multiple demanding business ventures that each required his personal oversight and decision-making. His involvement in boxing through high-profile partnerships, his expansion into new international markets, his development of the Power Slap League, all of these required constant attention and hands-on management. The alleged massive contract had arrived at precisely the moment when the UFC president was least able to devote his complete, undivided attention to resolving this kind of major conflict through the intensive hands-on negotiation and relationship management that had characterized his leadership style for more than 2 decades of building the UFC into a global powerhouse. Industry insiders, the kind of people who know where all the bodies are buried in combat sports business, immediately began speculating about the true nature of this alleged massive contract that had sent Dana into orbit. Some suggested it involved a major streaming platform, maybe Netflix or Amazon, seeking to build a comprehensive sports entertainment division that could compete directly with the UFC's dominance. Others pointed toward international gaming companies, particularly those operating in the cryptocurrency and online betting spaces, looking to expand their presence in the Latin American and North American markets, using Pereira's massive appeal in both regions. Still other sources whispered about something even more threatening, a consortium of wealthy investors seeking to build a completely new competing combat sports promotion with Pereira as its central attraction, its founding superstar around which they could build an entire organization. Whatever the specific details turned out to be, and sources were being extremely tight-lipped about the exact nature of the deal, the alleged contract represented a fundamental challenge to the UFC's entire business model and philosophy. Dana White had built his empire on the principle that the organization controlled all major commercial aspects of its fighters' careers, from sponsorship deals to media appearances to competitive opportunities outside the Octagon, and this alleged massive contract threatened to blow a massive hole in this carefully constructed wall of control that had taken decades to build and perfect. The relationship between Dana White and his fighters has always operated on this unspoken but absolutely understood agreement that the UFC comes first in all commercial considerations, that individual promotional opportunities exist within a framework that ultimately serves the organization's interests above all else. This understanding has been tested numerous times throughout the promotion's history, with various fighters attempting to push boundaries and test limits, invariably facing serious consequences when they ventured too far into territory the organization considered off-limits or threatening to its core business interests. Dana White has built the UFC into a billion-dollar enterprise by maintaining absolutely tight control over every single aspect of his fighters' commercial activities, from the logos on their shorts, to the products they can endorse, to the events they can appear at. The alleged massive contract that Pereira had signed represented a direct frontal challenge to this control. A challenge that White was absolutely not prepared to accept without the fight of his life. The collision between the UFC's institutional interests and Pereira's personal commercial ambitions had been building slowly for months, like tectonic plates grinding against each other, but the alleged contract brought this conflict to a head in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The UFC president has demonstrated time and again his willingness to draw hard lines when it comes to sponsor relationships and fighter conduct, establishing a reputation for uncompromising enforcement that has become absolutely legendary within the combat sports community and struck fear into the hearts of fighters who might consider testing those boundaries. He famously told a major sponsor to go F themselves when they called demanding he remove a pro-Trump video from his personal social media account, demonstrating that his principles extend far beyond mere commercial considerations, and that he absolutely refuses to be dictated to regardless of how much money might be at stake or how powerful the people making demands might be. The framework within which UFC fighters operate has evolved significantly over the years, reflecting the organization's growing commercial sophistication and its increasing desire to control absolutely all aspects of fighter marketability and commercial appeal. The organization's controversial partnership with Reebok fundamentally changed how fighters could monetize their appearances, stripping away individual sponsor logos that fighters had negotiated independently and replacing them with standardized apparel and a collective sponsorship payment system that centralized complete control over fighter commercial activities within the organization itself. This move consolidated control over fighter sponsorships while simultaneously reducing the ability of individual athletes to command premium rates for their promotional real estate during the most visible moments of their careers, when millions of eyes were watching them perform. Critics argued passionately that the arrangement suppressed fighter earnings by eliminating the ability of popular athletes to negotiate individual sponsorship deals that reflected their actual market value and drawing power. The UFC maintained that the standardized system provided fair compensation across the board and eliminated the chaotic visual presentation of fighters covered in competing sponsor logos that made broadcasts look unprofessional. For Alex Pereira, navigating this complex landscape required considerable skill and strategic thinking, like walking through a minefield blindfolded. His manager Jorge Guimaraes has represented some of the biggest names in combat sports history, including legends like Anderson Silva, Jose Aldo, and Glover Teixeira, bringing decades of experience in dealing with the UFC's complex business relationship. This extensive experience and expert guidance helped Pereira maximize his commercial potential while ostensibly operating within the strict boundaries established by the UFC's contracts and policy. Guimaraes understood better than most managers exactly where the lines were drawn in the sand and perhaps also understood where those lines might be tested or pushed without triggering nuclear war with Dana White. The collection of 13 major brands that Pereira has endorsed across diverse industries represents strategic positioning that few fighters have achieved in the entire history of combat sports, creating multiple revenue streams that provide financial security beyond fighting. Each partnership was carefully constructed and negotiated to complement rather than conflict with his UFC obligations, creating multiple layers of income that supplemented his fight purses and built a solid financial foundation for his inevitable post-fighting career when his body could no longer take the punishment of elite competition. But the alleged massive contract represented something fundamentally different from the carefully calibrated endorsement deals that had characterized Pereira's commercial portfolio up to this point, something that crossed lines that had never been crossed before. Sources suggested this deal would have positioned Pereira in a commercial role that went far beyond simple brand ambassadorship, potentially creating direct conflicts with exclusive arrangements the UFC maintained with corporate partners across multiple industry verticals and geographic markets. This wasn't just another sponsor logo on his shorts or another product he'd mention in interviews. This was allegedly a partnership that would make Pereira a central figure, a key player in a business enterprise that operated completely independently of UFC control. The historical context for such conflicts was well established within the dramatic annals of UFC history, providing a roadmap for how these situations typically played out. Brock Lesnar famously angered Dana White by publicly promoting a competitor's product during his post-fight interview at UFC, declaring his preference for Coors Light when Bud Light was a major UFC sponsor, paying significant sums for exclusive promotional consideration and expecting that exclusivity to be protected. That incident resulted in what Lesnar later described as a serious whip-the-dog session with White, illustrating the absolute seriousness with which the UFC president approached sponsor relationships and his willingness to confront even his biggest stars when they crossed lines or threatened valuable partnership. For Pereira, the stakes were considerably higher given the alleged scope and scale of his outside contract, which reportedly dwarfed anything like the Lesnar incident in terms of potential financial impact and organizational threat. His extensive charitable work through Instituto Poatan in São Paulo, providing completely free combat sports training, English lessons, and computer classes to over 700 children from underprivileged backgrounds, had positioned him as a fighter with a legitimate social mission that extended far beyond personal wealth accumulation or fame seeking. This humanitarian dimension significantly complicated any potential conflict with the UFC, as White would need to carefully balance his business concerns against the public relations implications of appearing to obstruct a fighter's legitimate charitable interests and community involvement. Pereira's incredible backstory story of overcoming crushing poverty and debilitating alcoholism had endeared him to millions of fans worldwide, creating an emotional connection that transcended the typical athlete-fan relationship and made him nearly impossible to dislike. His childhood in Sao Paulo involved watching martial arts classes from outside the gym because his family could not afford the fees, a heartbreaking image that informed his later passionate commitment to providing those same opportunities completely free of charge through Instituto Poatan. The fighter's generous donations of over 1,000 food boxes to his hometown community and $120,000 toward flood relief efforts in southern Brazil demonstrated philanthropy that went far beyond mere public relations gestures or tax write-offs. This was genuine care for his community. The contractual limitations governing Pereira's activities were crystal clear when it came to competitive fighting in other organizations or sports. Pereira stated directly and publicly that he has a binding contract with the UFC and that Jake Paul knows he cannot go and fight elsewhere, suggesting that Paul's constant call-outs and social media campaigns were primarily promotional tactics designed to generate buzz rather than genuine attempts to arrange an actual fight. The Brazilian champion acknowledged having one professional boxing fight in his past and approximately 20 amateur boxing matches, demonstrating that his striking credentials extended far beyond just kickboxing into multiple combat disciplines, but he was clearly bound by his UFC contract when it came to competing elsewhere. However, the alleged massive contract that sparked Dana White's explosive reaction reportedly circumvented these fighting restrictions entirely by focusing on commercial activities rather than competitive fight, exploiting gaps in contractual language that had not contemplated large-scale commercial arrangements outside the traditional fighting context. This was allegedly the loophole that Pereira and his experienced management team had identified and exploited, a way to build commercial independence and financial security without technically violating his UFC contract's competitive restriction. White would need to balance his understandable business concerns against the public relations implications of appearing to obstruct a fighter's legitimate commercial interests, especially given Pereira's popular charitable work and inspiring personal story. The question was whether his legendary temper and control-focused management style would allow for such nuanced considerations, or whether the conflict would escalate into something that damaged both parties irreparably and created lasting animosity. The legal teams on both sides had reportedly begun analyzing every single clause of Pereira's existing UFC contract with microscopic attention to detail, searching for language that might either prohibit or permit the alleged massive outside arrangement. The outcome of this intensive legal analysis would likely determine whether the conflict could be resolved through private negotiation and compromise, or whether it would escalate into formal litigation that would play out in public and damage both parties' reputation. The combat sports world held its collective breath as news of the brewing conflict between Dana White and Alex Pereira filtered through the community via the whisper networks of managers, agents, and media insiders who monitor every development in the sport with obsessive attention to detail and insider knowledge. What had started as quiet whispers about an alleged massive contract outside the UFC had escalated into what sources described as a full-blown explosion from the UFC president, a response that reflected both his personal frustration and his broader concerns about maintaining iron-fisted control over his organization's most valuable assets and revenue generators. The reaction from inside the UFC offices was reportedly swift and intense, like a Category 5 hurricane making landfall. Executives who had grown accustomed to Dana White's volcanic temperament over years of working closely with him described this particular outburst as exceptional even by his formidable standards, suggesting that Pereira's alleged massive contract had touched a nerve that went beyond ordinary business concerns to something more fundamental about the organization's identity and its relationship with the athletes who competed under its banner. Dana White's management style has never been characterized by subtlety or restraint, and his reputation for colorful language and direct confrontation has become as much a part of the UFC brand as the Octagon itself or the famous buffer introductions. He has publicly stated that when sponsors challenge his authority or try to dictate his personal behavior, his response is to tell them to take their money and shove it where the sun doesn't shine, demonstrating a willingness to sacrifice potentially lucrative financial relationships in defense of his principles that has become legendary within the business community. This same uncompromising approach and refusal to be pushed around apparently informed his nuclear reaction to Pereira's alleged massive commercial maneuvering behind his back. The UFC president's extensive business interests had expanded dramatically beyond the Octagon in recent years, creating a portfolio of responsibilities that demanded attention across multiple time zones and industry verticals, stretching his capacity to manage everything personally. His involvement in boxing through the high-profile partnership with Turki Al-Sheikh in Saudi Arabia represented a major new frontier for the combat sports empire that White had built, with the UFC president acknowledging publicly that he would be running and managing the boxing business on behalf of his new partners in the Middle East. I would say yes, that Turkey and Saudi are the dominant players in boxing right now, and basically I'm gonna run and manage the business for them. This is not an easy business to be in, he stated, revealing the scope of his new responsibilities outside the UFC. The timing of Pereira's alleged massive outside contract coincided with this unprecedented expansion for TKO, the parent company, creating additional demands on White's time and attention that some industry observers wondered might eventually compromise his ability to maintain the hands-on management of UFC operations that had defined his leadership style for over 2 decades. White had acknowledged investing $10 to $12 million into jiu-jitsu promotion, going big on boxing ventures, continuing to oversee all UFC operations, and transitioning PowerSlap to YouTube, creating a portfolio of combat sports properties that demanded constant attention and executive decision-making across multiple platforms and markets. This rapid expansion had come at a significant personal price, however, creating demands on White's capacity and energy that raised serious questions about long-term sustainability and whether one person could effectively manage such a diverse portfolio. Questions had been raised by industry insiders about when White might need to delegate more responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, with the UFC president himself admitting that the current year would reveal whether he could sustain his current breakneck pace of activity across all his business ventures without something suffering or falling through the cracks. Against this backdrop of organizational expansion and personal strain, the devastating news of Pereira's alleged massive outside contract demanded immediate attention at precisely the moment when White was already stretched thin across multiple demanding business ventures and international partnerships. The UFC president reportedly viewed this development as a personal betrayal of the trust he had placed in one of his most prominent champions, a feeling compounded by the considerable promotional resources the organization had invested in building Pereira's star power and global appeal from scratch. His training partner and mentor, Glover Teixeira, had spoken publicly about Pereira's ambitious humanitarian goals, describing detailed plans to fix houses for underprivileged families in Brazil and expand charitable operations far beyond the current Instituto Tupotan framework. These philanthropic goals potentially intersected with the alleged massive outside contract in ways that complicated any simple narrative of commercial opportunism or greed, adding layers of complexity to what might otherwise be a straightforward business dispute. The UFC's response to Pereira's alleged massive outside contract would have implications that extended far beyond the immediate parties involved in this high-stakes dispute. Other fighters throughout the roster watched closely to see how the organization would handle a champion who had allegedly signed a significant deal outside UFC control, understanding that the precedent set by this conflict would shape future negotiations between the UFC and its athlete roster for years to come and potentially alter the balance of power permanently. Dana White's recent partnership with Monster Energy for a 5-year deal, placing the brand prominently in the center of the Octagon, illustrated the tremendous value the organization placed on exclusive commercial relationships that could not be diluted by competing arrangements involving individual fighters, making Pereira's alleged outside deal even more threatening to the business model. Pereira's upcoming title defense against Magomed Ankalaev, reportedly scheduled for January 24, 2025 at T-Mobile Arena, as part of the UFC's inaugural broadcast on Paramount+, meant the organization had significant interest in maintaining a productive working relationship with its light heavyweight champion regardless of whatever commercial disputes might be brewing behind the scenes in boardrooms and legal offices. For Dana White, the challenge was balancing his fundamental principles about organizational control against the practical reality that Pereira represented one of the UFC's most valuable assets in an increasingly competitive market for combat sports entertainment, where competitors like PFL and One Championship were actively trying to poach talent with lucrative offers. The UFC had generated record revenues exceeding $1.3 billion without significant contributions from Conor McGregor, demonstrating the organization's impressive ability to thrive without any single fighter, no matter how popular or marketable they might be. However, Pereira's unique appeal, his devastating knockout power, his compelling rags-to-riches backstory, his global commercial reach spanning multiple continents and demographics, made him a difficult talent to alienate entirely without significant business consequence. The story of Alex Pereira and Dana White represented a broader tension within combat sports between organizational control and individual athlete rights that would only intensify as the sport continued to grow and generate unprecedented revenue, attracting more outside investment and creating more opportunities for fighters to build independent commercial empires. The evolution of fighter commercial rights had accelerated dramatically as social media platforms gave athletes direct access to their fans without requiring organizational intermediation or approval, changing the fundamental dynamics of athlete-organization relationship. Pereira represented the new model of fighter commercial independence, a champion who understood that his earning window was limited by the physical demands of combat sports and who sought to maximize his income potential during the peak years when his star power was at its absolute height. His sophisticated approach to commercial partnerships reflected a level of business acumen that earlier generations of fighters had rarely possessed, and the alleged massive contract outside the UFC was reportedly the culmination of this sophisticated strategy to build long-term financial security. The resolution of this explosive situation would provide a template for future negotiations, setting precedents that would shape the industry for years to come and influencing how the next generation of fighters approach their relationships with the organizations that employed them and made their careers possible. The question remained whether Dana White's explosive reaction to this alleged massive contract outside the UFC would ultimately accommodate the commercial ambitions of his most marketable champion through negotiation and compromise, or whether the conflict would create a permanent rupture in one of the sport's most valuable relationships that could not be repaired through any amount of money or legal maneuvering. The implications extended far beyond financial considerations into fundamental questions about the future of combat sports. At stake was the fundamental question of how much autonomy UFC fighters could claim over their commercial identities, when those identities had been largely constructed through the massive platform the organization provided, the global audience it delivered, and the promotional machine it operated. Dana White had always maintained that the UFC created stars rather than simply employing athletes who were already famous, and that this creative role entitled the organization to significant control over how those stars monetize their fame and commercial appeal. Only time would tell how this conflict would ultimately resolve, but one thing was absolutely certain. Dana White had exploded over this alleged massive contract outside the UFC, and the reverberations of that explosion would be felt throughout the entire combat sports industry for years to come, potentially changing how business is conducted at the highest levels of mixed martial arts forever. So where does this leave us when we really break down what's happening here? Dana White built his entire empire on one fundamental principle: control. Every sponsorship deal, every media appearance, every single dollar that flows through the system, it all goes through him and his organization first. That's not just ego talking, that's pure business strategy, and for more than 20 years nobody has seriously challenged this system of total organizational control until right now. Alex Pereira isn't just another fighter trying to make a quick buck on the side with some energy drink endorsement or clothing deal. This is a guy who literally came from absolutely nothing, watching martial arts classes through a gym window because his family couldn't afford the monthly fees, working his way up from the streets of Sao Paulo to become a two-division champion, a legitimate knockout artist, and a global brand that transcends the sport itself. And somewhere along the way, during his incredible rise to the top, he realized something that's absolutely dangerous to Dana's business model. He doesn't need the UFC as much as they need him. That realization, that shift in the power dynamic, is exactly what made Dana explode with that legendary fury. Not just the money involved or even the contract itself. It's what this whole situation represents. A crack in the foundation of everything he's built, a challenge to the system that's made him one of the most powerful people in sports entertainment. Because if Pereira gets away with this alleged massive outside contract, if he successfully breaks free from the traditional control structure, every champion watching right now is taking detailed notes. Every manager in the business is making phone calls to test the waters. Every agent is looking for the same legal loophole that Pereira apparently found, and suddenly the entire system that Dana has spent decades perfecting starts to crumble piece by piece. The UFC will survive this conflict. They always do. They're too big, too established, too well funded to be taken down by any single dispute. But the game itself, the fundamental balance of power between fighters and the organization, that delicate relationship that's defined mixed martial arts business for over 2 decades, that might never be the same again. Dana White exploded for a very specific reason. He saw the future of fighter independence coming straight at him, like a freight train, and it absolutely terrified him. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of the most significant conflicts in UFC history. Make sure to check out the other explosive stories we've covered by clicking on the cards appearing on your screen right now.